stuff. This is really complicated but very exciting work. And so I'm going to hopefully just spend a little bit of time just giving an overview of sort of where we're coming from, another little chunk of time about sharing some stories, sort of how our lessons learned and sort of our influences that, from internationally to Chicago. And then the last chunk of time just talking about how that then led to the work we're doing today and try and summarize that in a way that might be useful to folks. So my name is Erica Swinney. I am the program director at Manufacturing Renaissance. We're a small not-for-profit. Actually, I'm here today instead of my father, Dan Swinney, who was
famous.
Yes, thank you. He'll appreciate that. And he was very sorry he couldn't make it. But so he suckered me into stepping in for him. So I'm happy to be here. And actually a lot of this PowerPoint presentation is ridiculously long, so I'm going to be fast and loose with the slides, but this is something that we'll be sending out, so if there's anything hopefully of interest, you can have time to review it later. And of course, I really want to also get to the part where we get to have questions and discussion and things like that. But just quickly, a little bit of my background. So I've been working, so Dan, my father, who started the organization that used to be called the Midwest Center for Labor Research, and then the Center for Labor and Community Research, now Manufacturing Renaissance. So a lot of this work is really based on 40 years of his work as a machinist, a labor leader, going into starting this small not-for-profit and really on the front lines of plant closings through the 80s, and then going into much more proactive work into the 90s and 2000s. But for me, I really come to this work because, like most teenagers, I could care less what my dad did for a living. I was like, manufacturing, who cares? Whatever the latest Christian Slater movie coming out was more interesting to me at that time. But I went out to, even though I grew up on the west side of Chicago, I was lucky enough to have a chance to live in the San Francisco Bay Area. I came of age and really start, my background is actually as an ecologist. Actually, I worked doing habitat restoration around the Bay Area and had a calling to get involved into the environmental justice movement, where I became an organizer. And that was really my, the first time really working with youth and doing a variety of campaigns and leadership development, grassroots leadership development. And it was actually in that context that I really got introduced to manufacturing. It was in that context of, the nth protest we were doing against whatever XYZ corporation that was polluting XYZ community, and finally being like, really, is this all we can do? And that's really when I first learned about Mondragon. That's when I first started. I was like, oh wait, Dad, wait, what do you do again? Like something manufacturing? Wait, tell me about that. So that's when I really first was ready to understand and be open to what manufacturing as a vehicle for community development that we can really infuse in our values. So this is what this presentation represents, is sort of this manufacturing as a vehicle for community development, in which cooperative worker co-ops can be a powerful strategy. And so we'll just go through some slides. So we all know this. We're in a crisis, systemic crisis. Okay, I have to make sure I keep track of where I am. But essentially, you guys know this. The system is in crisis, and therefore it requires a systemic response, a systemic solution. And so some of the themes that I wanted to just touch upon really briefly, and most of you in this room know already why manufacturing matters. And then the context of what the second industrial revolution, actually that's a framework that my father just published in a paper that was just published recently in the National Academy for Engineering. It's on our website, but it's sort of his spin, and in a nutshell, I won't go into too much detail today, but in a nutshell is essentially the private sector has failed in its stewardship of economic development on behalf of our communities. There was a social contract where the labor movement, communities were essentially dependent on for decades since World War II, and so and technology was used as a tool to create wealth on behalf of essentially the private sector, and then the public sector were really good at helping distribute that wealth. Well, that paradigm has really failed, and it's failing as we speak, and we all know that. And so the second industrial revolution really refers to the real revolution, not just based on technology, which, you know, some people might count up to 4. We're up to the fourth revolution, you know, internet or informational technologies, but really the revolution that is still yet to come is the social control of industry for public development, for a public agenda on community and economic development. So that's what that. But I encourage you to read that paper. It's on our website, and it's called Balance. It's called like Balancing Technology Innovation with Social Inclusion. But yeah, if you go on our website, you'll see it pretty quickly. But so yeah, and essentially, our experience is such that manufacturing was not, the decline of manufacturing really wasn't inevitable, in our opinion. What was inevitable was, you know, and what technology actually unveiled was the public, you know, the private sector using technology not as a way to, you know, for the long-term stewardship of our manufacturing economy. It all of a sudden changed into a way in which they can make short-term profits and actually cannibalize manufacturing, but it had nothing to do with manufacturing inherently not being viable, in our opinion. And so we know why manufacturing matters. It's, you know, it's really about this is high wages, on average compensation $75,000 a year. The multiplier effect for every one job there creates 5 to even 9 jobs in the broader economy. I can explain a little more about that later. And we really see this as a strategic tool to reducing poverty. We feel manufacturing can build social capital. We feel it's the sector to address issues of the environmental crisis. I kind of touched on that. So essentially, what we see moving forward is is finding a variety of ways to build what we call high road partnerships between public and private sector. Not to say private sector can no longer be involved, obviously, but saying that, you know, we are in an era now where this is really how us as, you know, involved in the welfare of our communities we need to be proactively involved, finding a variety of ways to work in the private sector, inserting our values, and cooperatives is a way to do that. So getting into a little bit sort of our influences and my father was a machinist and got laid off by he was working for Taylor Forge in the west side of Chicago, was laid off in the early 80s. And really, again, this is an example of a good company that chose a different way to earn profits. They were no longer in the business of what they were manufacturing. They were using financial tools that were emerging at the time and extracting from the company, a perfectly good company. And a lot of the plant closings that the organization was involved with, some companies needed to close, you know, for good reasons, but there were a lot of companies, and we would say, in fact, most companies, you know, could have stayed open if there was a more proactive campaign, coalition of public and private interests working together. But so once and I'll tell a couple stories later, but what gave us confidence in this was, in fact, stories like Mondragon, where we saw great examples of the public sector interest playing an innovative role in manufacturing. And this was an ideal example where essentially, and for us, the takeaway lesson from the experience at Mondragon was the cooperatives was like the icing on the cake aspect. For us, the cake was the education and the focus on manufacturing. And that is really the foundation to building a variety of different entrepreneurial, social programs that benefit communities. And so that was incredibly inspirational. Another international influence was really learning about Emilia-Romagna. Again, another great example where you have a mix of, it's a manufacturing-rich region, but and there are a lot of cooperatives, but it's also mixed with private sector, you know, privately owned businesses as well. But where this is a great example of the government really playing a useful role in supporting these kinds of companies, where the government is helping network, it's helping provide information to clusters and sectors, helping these small companies work together to be more competitive in the global marketplace. So this, again, another example of public sector really playing an innovative role in the private sector. So deindustrialization in America, I mean, so coming back home to Chicago where there was a, you know, Chicago lost 4,000 out of 7,000 companies, and I think that came out to about 200,000 jobs in the Chicago area, and this kind of exacerbated all kinds of racial, social politics. So this is the company my father worked for, and essentially, that was the strategy, the milking the cash cow. This was, and there's some famous quote by the person who owned U.S. Steel, which was the most profitable steel company in the world, and whoever I can't remember the name of the CEO, but he's like, I'm not in the business to make steel, I'm in the business to make money, and that really was what characterized this at this time. So again, nothing to do with the underlying business. It was really the mentality of this very elite private sector that were driving, intentionally mismanaging these businesses into the ground. And so we also did a lot of studies during this time. Let me just jump to this slide. I'll go back to the other one. We did some these are 3 examples that really shaped our thinking, and I'm already behind time, I realize, but okay. Okay, good. I want to be respectful. But essentially, so Banker's Print was an example, was really, fueled by all this great inspiration from Mondragon and the cooperative, and really seeing worker cooperatives as a real viable tool for organizing. This kind of became a tool in our toolbox, so to speak. And so Banker's Print was an example of a small print shop on the south side of Chicago. This is kind of a classic story where you had an aging owner. He had throat cancer, could not find someone to sell his business to. One of his customers actually came to us and said, hey, maybe there's something you guys can do. We went over there and talked to him, and we asked if, hey, have you actually considered selling your company to your workers? And he was like, what? That's crazy. And so we're like, no, it's not crazy. We can help you with that. And so we then asked if it was okay to talk to the workers, and he was open to that. And we talked to the workers, and same question, hey, have you ever thought about buying this company? And this was a group of workers who'd been in this business for 20, 30 years. And literally the thought never crossed their mind that was even an option. So so we said, hey, we could sort of help out with that. And so they retained us and to do a feasibility study on the viability of the business. We went back to the owner and said, hey, the workers, we put together a package to buy the company for about $250,000. And the owner was like, no, I want $1 million. And we're like, okay, good luck with that. And a few months later, he came back and was like, okay. So he sold the company to the workers, and it formed into a worker cooperative. Stuart Warner was an example of using sort of the power of eminent domain as a vehicle for catalyzing worker ownership. Unfortunately, this was not a success stories. I mean, as a lot of you know, there's a lot of not failures, but failures along the way, and as part of this learning process. But we learned a whole lot, and this was working. We were brought in by the UE, and as part of the bargaining, they're in a bargaining process with the ownership of Stuart Warner, which was a pretty large manufacturer of automotive parts and lubricants on the northwest side of Chicago. We had, and as doing our research, we found that here you have a company that was aging, like the board of directors average age was 80 something, and it went from a company that was up until the early 80s, they were paying out 50%, 50% of profits was going back into the company, and 50% would go to the stockholders. And after the early 80s, all of a sudden it was year after year where they were paying out upwards of 200% of dividends to of profit to the shareholders. And so here, a clear pattern of literally sucking the life out of this company. Anyway, so that was the kind of information. We intervened, and actually we had one support to help the company. Actually, there was a interest of an investor who was willing to help the union do a hostile takeover because it was a publicly traded company. The UE actually at that time wasn't ready for that. And actually they did not, they really, and this is sort of part of the process, the learning curve of the labor movement of, really being skeptical of worker ownership and saying, no, there was a real fear of worker ownership corrupting workers and making them think and be managers. And it was a real obstacle. And so they actually turned that option down. And then there was another option, and we actually found an entrepreneur who was willing to take over a minority share, or who was going to buy the business with the union having minority share. And we actually took it all the way to the city council and actually the resolution lost by 1 vote. But again, a real learning lesson, and it was, and at that time, this is around the Harold Washington administration, there was a lot of really creative work with community organizations and engaging, union and community organizations really working together around an agenda, a worker buyout agenda. And then Brock Candy, another example where it really, and this one was, it was a $300 million buyout that we were organizing. We had a lot of inside information support actually from former CEOs of the company because the company was churning so quickly. They had like 5 CEOs in like 5 years, and the CEOs themselves were upset at how the company was intentionally mismanaging the business, setting the stage. A company that employed 4,000 people on the west side of Chicago, setting the stage for it to leave or to close down. And anyways, this was a great example of just, a real creative coalition, because again, there was also a real, that's management, we're workers, and the coalition actually was a management worker union community coalition that really that did this campaign that unfortunately did not, the owner ultimately refused. But it, again, set the stage for, just a lot of learning of what's possible. So this quickly goes into, this is, leads us through the late 80s. And at this time, manufacturing really had changed. And what really emerged where you had, by this point, you did have a lot of companies go offshore. And a new opportunity really emerged around, yes, it was, on one hand devastating, but it was also an opportunity, this concept of the skills gap. So we actually did a partnership with the Chicago Federation of Labor to study how manufacturing had changed in Cook County, which is where Chicago resides in. And so this study was really important because we wanted we were looking at the public sector system. We were looking at public education. We were looking at, training, various training providers, because what companies were telling us is that they suddenly couldn't find people for these medium to high skilled jobs paying like $20, $30, $40 an hour in communities like the west side of Chicago, where literally you have young people dying because they don't have access to gainful employment. And so you have these companies going with these jobs unfilled. It was sort of like, what? Like this is totally fixable. Like we sent somebody to the moon. Like we can totally get young people like a job in their own community. So it was kind of like, but we needed to, but as part of the study, it really, we found that in fact, Chicago, the education system really was totally failing. Modern manufacturers, because this was part of, and of course our young people, but here was, a win, a no-brainer of like, the Chicago public school system had pretty much started all, divesting from their vocational programs. The few programs that were left were really in name only. It was really about seat time. It was like hobby it was like the old school shops where it's like, let's build a birdhouse and this is how you make a hammer, and not really, you could go through a program like that and not have the skills to actually get one of these higher paying jobs. So, and we studied what was going on in Germany and Denmark in terms of their educational and workforce development systems. And essentially called for a vision of how do we help Chicago become on the leading edge of sort of education linked to advanced manufacturing in context of today's globalized economy. And so this study actually gave birth to the Chicago Manufacturing Renaissance Council, which really was because the first entity, when we published the paper, it was a little bit like crickets, we didn't really get a lot of, hey, that's great. It was just like, okay. But the entity that really engaged us as a result of our findings was actually the Illinois Manufacturers Association, which is a notoriously Republican business entity, but they really worked with us because they're like, finally somebody is calling it for what it is, and finally this is something that we can sort of, yes, this is a problem that our members are having, and how can we work together? And we're like, okay. So essentially the Renaissance Council really became this, and this was years of work in formulating and essentially bringing these multi-stakeholders to the table. So it was, across the political spectrum, but all focused on the importance of manufacturing in this region, education being at the heart of it. And just a little bit, Austin on the west side of Chicago, Austin lost 90% of its industrial base in this time. And another important issue that we found in our study is, in Illinois, and I'm sure this is typical where you are, 99% of manufacturing companies are white male owned. And for us, that was a really, okay, this is an important opportunity. This is an important dimension that we need to, again, be really proactive about. If we're talking about the future and the future leadership of manufacturing, how do we really start to, this is an opportunity for how do we get our young people really poised to be actively pursuing these career paths that end up in ownership of companies. So the first project of the Renaissance Council was, was really focused on education, the educational infrastructure that would make these kinds of connections possible. And again, totally inspired by Mondragon and really starting with the school. And we've made a lot of success, but it also has weaknesses. But the great thing, so we worked with Chicago Public Schools to design this program, a school that is now a program that we call the Manufacturing Connect program that serves the school. But it's a public high school, so we don't run it, but we sort of were part of the design team, and we were sort of the technical assistance element that, because at this point, Chicago Public Schools, Chicago, no longer had anyone that worked for the public school district that had a current industry background. That was a huge obstacle. We're like, wow, we can't even find a teacher to teach our manufacturing. Chicago Public Schools pretty much closed down all the shops as their teachers retired and never reopened them. So essentially, what we did was said, hey, if we could create a school of a certain quality, and we're not going to do videos. I did embed a couple videos, so if you want to look later, it's a good snapshot of some of our great kids talking about what this program is about. But essentially, what the school represents is so what we brought are the partnerships, the partnerships with companies. So we have worked, the school's been open for about 8 years. We've worked with over 85 different local manufacturing companies, providing everything, coordinating, organizing everything from work, internships, summer jobs. Our program is really based on students earning nationally recognized industry credentials. We designed and installed the machine shop, again, something that CPS no longer had the capacity to do. We developed our own curriculum so that young people can actually earn these nationally recognized credentials. So our goal is that every student graduates high school with their high school diploma and a nationally recognized competency-based credential. They take 3 to 4 years of a pre-engineering, so it's not just machining, it's not just we're very intentional. This is not a vocational program. This is really about educating the next generation of leadership in manufacturing. Now, we, of course, because of our background and our interests, we would love this to be, the full polytechnical, kids learning, having their co-op class in addition to their engineering class. That was untenable, just based with that's another long story after my drink of wine of the challenges with working with Chicago Public Schools. But the issue someone brought up earlier, the importance of, it wasn't just the technical training for the students, but it's also the training for the teachers, and that's a huge missing link, I think. And that, as I would love to hear, because I think, man, I think we figured out what we could do. Like, if we could like replicate it, like you don't have to do it like we did. Like, I think we figured out a good recipe that if we could do it, and our goal is that there should be a program like this, what we call the Manufacturing Connect program, in schools across the country that link young people, regardless of where they are on the academic spectrum, to multiple career paths. You know, so everything from a machinist to going into a doctorate in nanotechnology and running ownership, you know, management ownership and everything in between. I mean, we actually even had a partnership with John Marshall Law School. They have they're a specialist in intellectual property rights. So we actually had our engineering kids doing mock trials in intellectual property, because intellectual property is a really important thing in technology fields and manufacturing. And so we really are we are intentional about in exposing our young people to the broad range. So it's not just, yeah, you're going to spend a day with this machinist, but our kids spend the day with the president of the company, because most of the companies we work with are these small companies. So we have since, the Chicago Manufacturing Renaissance Council has since spawned a couple other, you know, it's works in progress, but we have a national structure. These are some of the participants. You know, we've been entertaining a lot of partnerships abroad. Actually, Australians love us, you know, so we actually had a group of Aboriginal Australians come visit us a couple years ago. We actually did take a group of kids to Mondragon a couple years ago. And so, in terms of, just to wrap up, and I went way over. The whole point is that this is a framework. You know, I feel like manufacturing creates, and actually I like what Mr. Asasti talked about, the tractor. You know, this is this meaty, dynamic landscape that by focusing on manufacturing, you can have tentacles that go into a variety of different related, cool, mutually beneficial projects, whether it's cooperatives or not. But it creates a good reason for you to create really creative partnerships with across the public and private sector spectrum. Everybody is interested in education. Everybody's interested in, well, not everybody, but a lot of people are interested in community development. And, you know, and so whether you're ready to start a cooperative or not, you know, having a focus that really meets immediate needs, like having a young person get a career track job, is you know, so another thing that is now also on my plate, I now have this awesome group of alumni who are now working in manufacturing, and that is who that's who I want to organize. Like, these are that's my people right there, because they get it. They're walking the walk. They totally get what this potential is about. Now the work really begins now with those young people. We have now young people who have been working on the job 1 to 3 years. We have our first homeowner. Like, he just bought a house. He's like 21 years old. So so that's really exciting. And I mean, so yeah, it's just small numbers. But when we started, we had 0 young people aspiring to be owners in manufacturing. Now we have like 20. And that's really awesome. Like, and of course, you know, as we get better, and as you know, we've just started a mentoring program. We've started lots of related programs, not just focus on the skills. But we really do see this as a fundamentally community development project.